Good morning. Welcome everybody to Recovery Cafe's monthly volunteer training. It is Friday, March 19th, 2021. Our topic today is crisis management and de-escalation. And I'd like to now introduce Judson Haynes, who is the navigator with the Port Townsend Police Department. If you just want to say a brief hello, and then I'm going to do a little more song and dance about the cafe.
Hey everyone, happy to be here. Song and dance.
So Recovery Cafe, for those of you who don't know, the mission of our program here, which we are a program of Deaf House Advocacy Services, and what we are attempting to do here is to build community. It is a safe and supportive community for everybody who is looking for love, belonging, healing, and the joy of contributing. We define recovery very broadly. It does include mental illness, homelessness, addiction, and also any other life challenge. One of our mantras is everybody's in recovery from something. We all need community to get through. We need healthy relationships to support us. So that's what we hope to build here. We do have a nice building here at 939 Kearney Street. We very recently opened on Thursday afternoons from 1 to 3 p.m. We'd like to invite any and all of you to come join us. We do have COVID protocols that we will tell you all about when you arrive here at the front door, but it's the same deal with masks and physical distancing and all of that. But we're very excited to have that and would love to see any of you guys there. Our purpose for volunteer trainings is that we hope to empower peer leadership here. What we would love to have are folks who are building skills to support our own and other people's recovery. So then when we're in the cafe space with all these folks who are coming to look for recovery support, then maybe we'll be able to help direct them or listen or provide support, make good referrals, those kinds of things. So that's one of the purposes of volunteer trainings. Another is that it's another way to build community so that we get to know each other a little bit better. We see some familiar faces. Then when we see each other in person, even with a mask on, we can say hello. And the third purpose is so that we get to know what resources exist in our community to support people in recovery, and introducing people to providers like Judd, who then we may be able to make referrals to because we have a better sense of what their role is in the community. So with that, I think I will turn it over to Judd. And I know I had said I would give you an outline of today. So Judd has some material that he's going to share. I would love, Judd, if you don't mind, to share about your role with the police department and what sorts of calls you get, kind of an introduction on that level. And then I believe there will be time for question and answer afterward. I don't know if I want to go too far into really specific cases, but question and answer, that would be great. We do have a brief time together. So I'm going to stop talking now and give it over to Judd.
Great. Thanks, Brian. And also I'll be sharing my screen, so hopefully that's set up here in a little bit. So again, hi everyone, my name is Judd Haynes. Again, I'm the navigator with the Port Townsend Police Department. What that means is, well, depends on the week, I think, and the needs of the community. I have seen a shift in how much time I spend with different groups. And I think over the past several months, there has been a sharp increase in how much time I spend, let's say, with people with memory impairment related issues, sort of cognitive degeneration, Alzheimer's, dementia, those kind of things, as well as substance use related issues, trauma. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. So it's hard to say I simply just help or assist law enforcement with de-escalating crisis situations, because it has just spread. I spent most of the morning assisting someone without any history of mental health issues or substance use issues, figure out approaches to address a housing related matter, landlord tenant, and who to speak to, and kind of reducing barriers around that. And so similar to what Brian talked about regarding the goal of the Recovery Cafe, I think is me trying to be another supportive presence in not just doing things for people, but helping individuals develop skills and things of that nature. as a brief aside, I just completed, right before this started, I was talking to Brian about, our school woes, and just completed a project. And a part of that project, what came up inadvertently was programs like the Recovery Cafe. And so this is all just digging up a ton of research around different things, and not like any of you here need further reassurance, but the evidence is really promising so far regarding institutions like Recovery Cafe, especially filling a gap between kind of crisis services, hospitals, emergency psychiatric care, and other providers of behavioral health services, amongst other things. So that was kind of accidental, like I said, but the timing was interesting, as I knew I would be doing this a few days after. So I wanted to mention that. Lastly, I am a licensed mental health counselor and a substance use, they keep changing things on me, substance use dependency professional, SUDP, right? So duly licensed in those two things. And I have been the navigator here since April 2019. And so I anticipated doing this for a year or two, and it's still going. So we shall see. So that's essentially my introduction. I think we can kind of get started into de-escalation. Rather than giving a huge preface, I think I'll be able to cover a lot of different elements as I move through this presentation. And again, if anyone has questions, I'm sure they will come up. Please just make a note of them, and I can go back to any part of this presentation, as well as kind of answer any questions anyone has at the end. I don't think there's anything else I need to discuss before we get started, so I will share my screen and we'll get started. Let's see, here we go. Okay. Brian, is that coming up?
Yep, looks great.
Okay, wonderful. All right, so I put a bunch of additional words in here. I put brief review. I think saying anything is a comprehensive review of anything is a bold statement. So this is only going to attend to some parts. I want this to be approachable. I can get lost, just like my last conversation with Brian, into the gross details about matters and issues, which I find very enjoyable. So this one I try to cover a lot of ground, again, in language that regardless of one's expertise, whether they are have multiple doctorates or very unfamiliar with crises or de-escalation or anything, can grasp. So, and again, it's just a guide. I don't intend for any of this to be in situation A, do B, and I'll get into why that is. So the primary goal of de-escalation is just, when people ask what that is, I just say it's like someone from a very high state of tension, a very, in a very, in a crisis state, to well, move from that state. And that's pretty much it. I don't think it needs to be overly complicated. The methods to get there, though, that's where things get relatively complicated. But before that, I will discuss this. So in this profession, I have found for myself, the longer I've done this, the more I think I value self-reflection, self-assessment, consultation, supervision, things of that nature, to identify how I respond to certain situations. And this is just a brief example. And it doesn't necessarily mean it goes from worst to best. I think there are many cases where a collaborative response to a situation is not applicable for a variety of reasons due to the person's functioning or other factors. But I think one of the most critical elements in de-escalation is some degree of awareness of how someone typically deals with conflict, and building it from there. And what is extraordinarily important is hopefully bringing up these types of questions in a space that is not judgmental. I unfortunately have experience in working different mental health facilities and things like that, where someone has to almost pretend like, yes, I can deal with all nature of problems, when in fact that doesn't serve the person coming in for help or the provider of those services. So just want to mention that and strongly advocate that for everyone, they can have open discussions about how they address conflict. So I include this one. I get this question a lot. It's like, well, can we predict if someone's going to be aggressive or violent? And the short answer is no. Behaviorists may disagree with me to a degree as far as, well, we can predict some behaviors. And my response to that is yes, if you account for as many variables as possible and all these other things. But I put this in the context of people coming into the Recovery Cafe. Let's say if they're not well known. If they're 30 years old, like what's been going on for the past 3 decades is unknown. All the other variables that can possibly influence someone's behavior are unknown. And as far as research goes, these are the best predictors of especially physical violence. So I'm not talking about verbal escalation or yelling or anything, but someone who's physically violent. And just so I'm really clear, I've been in some very unpleasant situations, but since beginning in April 2019, I have not been assaulted once from anybody. So I would say in this area, at least, the risk is relatively low, but it's always there. And again, it's always important to be safe and not be in situations where vulnerabilities increase. But so history of past behavior is one of the best predictors of future behavior, but that hopefully doesn't stereotype someone who has a violent history, doesn't assume that they're going to be violent. It's just a factor that evidence has shown to be influential. Someone who is impaired by substances, that's going to lower, it can increase their impulsivity, lower judgment, things like that. And someone who has a high degree of exposure to physical, verbal violence, abuse, things like that, may be more prone to engaging in those sort of behaviors. And then again, all these other risk factors. And a part of that, I include just to be aware of all of the variables in place, not just around violence, but just around behavior. And hopefully not to kind of personalize certain behaviors as this person is just a bad person or something. There's all these influences that go into why people do what they do. And by hopefully discerning kind of what those are and having the patience to identify those factors, remediation or other things can be more directed to addressing those issues. So that's why I include those. Moving on. So this is a perspective on escalation. And there's a lot of, well, what if this, what if that regarding these kind of graphs. And this was made for critical incident training for law enforcement, just to give them the perspective that when they contact a person typically in crisis, they're contacting them pretty high up on this wave. And also just to provide the information around that if someone is in a very heightened state of anger or rage, that applying cognitive strategies or reasoning strategies aren't really going to be mostly effective. It's about responding to behaviors, about encouraging just safety precautions and things like this. And I have no doubt that there are plans in place regarding, hey, what do we do if someone comes in and they're in a rage state? And if not, it's a relatively easy, plan to put together. So there's a lot happening here in this graph. I don't want to get too lost in this. It says like baseline. I think sometimes people assume that baseline is here's how someone's always functioning all the time. And if anything, it's the average mean mood state of somebody. However, keeping in mind that for some people I contact, their baseline is going to be further up on the anger / agitated state. So there may be less room between anger and, or rather between their baseline and jumping right into anger, extreme agitation, things like that. And the more I've gotten to know someone, the more I'm able to adapt to that and also disengage when appropriate if just our contact is leading to that. Also, people can re-escalate, and that is not a failure on anyone's part. It's just dependent on so many processing factors of a situation and so much context that can happen too. But again, going into the skills I'll be discussing here shortly is maintaining those, even if they're, and this can go on and on and on a few times, but also the follow-up is really important. There's been, there can be an increase in suicidal ideation and other problematic kind of thinking and kind of behaviors following an intense crisis episode. So the timeline around this is it can be a few minutes to hours, and for some people, days sort of spread out. So it's really dependent on the situation. So first skill is breathing. I initially, when first started, and it's not this as a navigator, but kind of mental health therapist, when people talked about things like suicide or even some trauma, my breath would get really shallow. I would even hold it at times, and the real basics I would lose. And so remembering to breathe is really important. I think I developed this slide for law enforcement, and I called it because they respond to certain language. I call it like tactical breathing or something, and they thought that was cool. So whatever works, I just have to remind myself just breathing, and square breathing is a specific strategy, especially in a intense situation, because it's not complicated. I don't need a notebook to like, okay, how does this meditative mindful breathing practice go? It's 3 to 5 seconds in, hold, 3 to 5 seconds out, hold, and repeat. And this helps reduce my own reactions to a crisis situation and helps me maintain my higher kind of executive functioning tasks in an intense situation. So I imagine some of you here are probably yogis or expert breathers and something. So please don't be offended by this very basic thing, but just remembering to breathe in during a crisis is exceptionally important. So de-escalation, attitude. So not only anecdotally, but just from my research around this, how their presence to me is one of the most significant factors on outcome during a crisis situation, whether someone's agitated or really confused or whatever, or just frightened for any reason, is the attitude with which one approaches that situation. It's to me, it's as similar to effects on different treatment modalities. And people, in my field, they can argue all day long about what's best, but pretty much what ends up being one of the more significant factors is what someone believes is going to be helpful. So in that same vein, how someone approaches a situation is so extraordinarily critical. And so from physically, verbally, all of those factors come into play. And I think I'll be able to be a little more specific about those here in a bit. I include mindfulness. Several years ago, I started incorporating that into my practice, mindfulness strategies with clients. And John Kabat-Zinn was one of the people who really originated this. He was historically an anesthesiologist, something like that, but also found that these practices that he didn't just magically come up with, pulled from other theories and belief systems and things like that, were really helpful with addressing things that medications were having a hard time dealing with, and other kind of known treatments. And I included that quote because it's pretty long-winded, but I think it really encapsulates all that goes on in being mindful around something. It's not just being like, hey, I'm present and I kind of know what's going on. There's purpose to it. It's the element of being non-judgmental is critical, not only of the person, but of oneself. And I think this shows up oftentimes with people like, I should know how to fix this or resolve this. And I think for me, at least, when I have that thought, it's a pretty arrogant thought that all of a sudden I'm assuming I know everything about this person to solve their problem, or assume that they haven't tried to resolve their problems and just let them build or something. So non-judgmental, being non-judgmental, and being also conscious of not what's happening with that person, but what's happening with oneself. So if I'm feeling really tense and guarded and defensive, that's telling of maybe the scene. And by breathing and things like that, I can attend to that, which inadvertently may reduce the tension around a situation versus me trying to, well, I'll address their tension by becoming more tense, and something's got to give eventually, which again, in my experience, those sort of emotions or behaviors typically don't cancel themselves out. They just build and exacerbate. So comment on what you notice, especially if there's a change. So being aware, sometimes if anything, it can kind of interrupt someone's thought process. If you notice that it's just like, you seem to be beginning a little more agitated, it's just stating a fact. It's about observing, or you seem to be breathing a little easier right now. It seems maybe so obvious. And I don't know, like that's going to annoy them or something, but it's attending to what's happening in the moment versus let's get to problem solving immediately. And to me, this is what I've seen in myself and other people really kind of get tripped up, is trying to address problems when someone is in that really heightened emotional crisis state. And I think the next slide talks about this. Yes. I just put a person in crisis has impaired cognitive function. By impaired, I just mean the parts of their brain that are really functioning at a high level, the midbrain, things like that, are activated, and it requires different parts of the brain to show up in order for there to reinstate some balance and to be able to actually get into problem solving strategies and things like that. And so by attending to the kind of their heightened emotional state, it is possible to get to that place. And how long this takes, again, like I will repeatedly say, it depends so much on, let's say someone with the TBI or other issue, it's going to be potentially completely different. And it may just be focused on helping them slow down those parts of their brain that are hyper functioning. Simple questions then. Getting into, I'm going to ask you 14 questions and see if you can remember all of them and answer them in order. I can't do that when I'm perfectly calm, so I'm not going to ask someone that when they're not calm. And so just saying why I'm there. It's like, I just want to understand what's going on right now, and I'll use those time-oriented statements like, hey, right now, what's happening? And most of the time, they're not talking about what's happening right now. They immediately go into what has happened or what they think will happen. So that suggests to me they're trying to process things that aren't really existing here in the present moment. And so that's pretty telling to me. And I'll listen to that and say, okay, but right now, I'm here, you're here. What's going on right now? And that can sometimes, in some cases, interrupt that thinking process that some people just fall into automatically of getting caught in the past or in the future. So this can also include questions like, are you okay with me sitting here or standing this close to you? And I know there's 6 foot exception or changes now and things like that, but just asking questions about, because that helps them. And it may not, they may just ignore that rather. But it's also trying to pull them into the present moment, because I would imagine that someone in the recovery cafe, it's not the recovery cafe isn't an environment of like everyone's in a crisis state and it's not a, I don't know, I think of like the stock exchange or something. It's not that kind of place. So if their attention's able to pull a little bit from what is sort of fueling the crisis into what's happening in that space, that can also help to de-escalate from the high state of tension to a lower state of tension. Sometimes things may come up that other people might find offensive or be problematic. And this is where options like, hey, I really want to respect your privacy. Can we speak over here about this or go outside or whatever the case may be? And like I said, right now, what would be helpful? And even if the answer is nothing, it's like, okay, just having to adapt to what their actual position is. So angry people who are angry. I think in general, it's helpful to really understand the problem before trying to find solutions. And I have to remind myself of that all the time, because I will be speaking with someone, and after their first 10 to 20 words, a part of my brain will be like, okay, I know what needs to happen. Like I'm somehow, I can see through time or anything. And to just quiet that part of my mind and actually listen, trying to listen to the details of the problem, or what's in between what they're saying, before just providing solutions. That's an important piece of it. And as I said earlier, is moving from that high state of tension to a lower state of tension, then go into problem solving if appropriate. Having multiple people asking questions or engaging actively, another person can be there, just standing there and hopefully with a calm demeanor, things like that, but not having multiple people interact is typically going to lead to more positive outcomes. Not moving around erratically. I have a tendency to move my hands around when speaking. And so I have to consciously, I just did it right now, I have to consciously slow that down a little bit and just clasp my hands together in front of me, things like that, because waving my arms around like this can be interpreted a lot of different ways. And I mentioned it a little lower, but there's also cultural and individual differences that some people, that's okay to talk with their hands, and some people that's highly distracting, annoying, and agitating. So again, individual differences will play a huge part in this, but by paying attention or listening or asking those questions, and I've asked people that, it's like, I just notice I'm moving my hands all around. Does that bother you? And even if it doesn't, it'll draw their attention to something that their brain isn't even considering relevant or important compared to what they're believing at the time is the most relevant and important thing. Be professional, but not a robot. Yeah, people have personalities, and hopefully they can be authentic with their personality and not try to, how do I completely be someone that I'm not? And I've seen amazing therapists, videos of them working, and of course I'm like, I want to be like that. Like of course people have their heroes, sports or movie stars and stuff, and I admire certain therapists, but with that being said, I'm not them. And so it's like, based on my personality, style, how I communicate, to accept that and work within that sphere. I think humor and honesty are completely appropriate at times. They're not necessarily distractions. I've seen, though, that some people have, I've done this most likely at times, and I've seen other therapists or people working with someone, like, if I just make them laugh or distract them, that's all they need, and they kind of get stuck in that, like, I'm just going to try to help them avoid this issue, which it may buy a little bit of time, but it will most likely just come back relatively quickly. Maintaining eye contact, that's dependent. Again, some people may find eye contact threatening, or someone, let's say with autism, typically, not always, but typically is going to have difficulty making eye contact. And that doesn't mean there's some psychopathology going on. It's just a preference for them. And I think most people naturally can pick up on that, and not necessarily assume what that must mean. It's something that may come up naturally during the conversation, may not be, but maintaining eye contact or not, I wouldn't say maintaining intense eye contact, but just natural eye contact can be important. Keeping an open mind, again, not just assuming what the problem is or the solution to those problems, but keeping an open mind of what they're saying, even if what they're saying is probably not, let's say, not based in reality, like, that's fine. It can provide some critical information about, yeah, it makes sense why they're going to be in this mood state if they believe that. I know one is that I was accused of operating a radio station or something, or a website rather, that whose sole purpose was to communicate to everyone else in Port Townsend about the actions of somebody. Well, that's not necessarily true, but for someone who actually believes that's happening, that's going to be pretty stressful. So it was very informing hearing that and trying to keep an open mind about, how to respond to that. Essentially meant like I couldn't be the one responding because I was actually the cause of the person's stress. So I didn't take that personally. It was just like, how do we adapt to what they believe? And another statement, I did not come up with this, but I have found it simple enough as a good reminder for me that sometimes the best we can do is admire the problem. Instead of refuting it or being like, oh, it's not so bad, or it'll be okay, but just to be like, yeah, this is a problem. I can see how this is a problem and how it's been a problem for you in your life. And then I just stop talking. And most of the time they will fill that space with providing a little more detail around it, because I think most people are used to patterns of, I'm going to say a problem and then I'm going to get advice, and then we're going to play this game back and forth. And rarely do they say, hey, here's my problem. Can you give me some advice on this? And so unless someone actually says to me directly, what do you think I should do? Or what do you suggest? Or can you give me advice on this? Or whatever the case may be, I'm not just going to offer it up. I'm going to try to ask relatively open-ended questions as appropriate to better understand how they perceive that problem, not how I perceive it. That's not going to really help them. So how they perceive it. We're doing on time. Okay. Moving on with people who are highly agitated, paraphrasing, not mirroring what they said necessarily. Like, I just heard you say this exact same thing. That's probably gonna be upsetting. If anyone did that to me, it'd be like, I just said that. So I put that in the context to kind of clarify, because if you read it through a book, it's like a whole chapter on how to paraphrase appropriately, versus here's what I heard you said. And it's really important that I understand what you're actually saying. I think can impart a sense of respect, and that you're actually actively listening to what they're saying, regardless of how logical or rational it may be. And for them to actually hear it reflected back. And oftentimes if it's something a little more wild, they'll hear it and be like, well, no, that's not really what I mean. And it's like, great, I'm glad I asked. So what does it you really mean? And it gives them an opportunity to kind of hopefully clarify the nature of the problem. And I'm terrible with putting up examples, because here's like one about masks, right? Everyone's sick of this, I know, but just a brief example of, rather than someone who's really agitated, like, I don't have to wear a mask. This is typically going to be a lot more expletives in my experience, but rather than going right into, well, you need to do this. And as just in general, I have rarely ever seen the two phrases, you need to, followed by anything, or calm down, ever be effective. It can happen, there is exceptions, but in my experience, that has really happened. So I have encountered people or businesses have called, and there's someone there who's very upset about something. It's like, yeah, I really disagree with this. And I don't get into politics about things or anything like that, but just have them, sometimes they just want someone to really listen to what they believe in. And then through that process, it's like, great, but this is what this store believes in. And so they'll also typically believe in things like respect and other stuff. And so we're able to find some common ground where, even if they don't have to change their mind about wearing a mask or the purpose of it, we can find another level that they do agree with, and find some resolution there. So I included there's so many fallacies, but the red herring one, I think people can get lost in these rabbit holes of, well, what about this? And what about this? And getting into these other issues that aren't really focused on the actual issue at hand or what's happening there, especially in a place like the Recovery Cafe. Here's what's happening at the Recovery Cafe, not the White House or in Europe or what happened 100 years ago. Here's what's happening right now. And it can be enticing to get pulled into that stuff as far as sort of debating these concepts. But by being present and focused on the matter at hand, or the crisis or issues at hand, it can help put some fencing around it, so people don't get hopefully feel cornered or lost, or I used to call it working with families, like getting lost in the maze, right? And for any of you who have gone in a maze and actually gotten lost, you know that feeling. And I actually use that when working with people, either in this as a navigator or in private practice. If I feel really lost, I just stop and be like, I'm really lost right now. I feel like I'm in a maze. And interestingly, a lot of times they're like, yeah, I'm pretty good at that. Like it's a skill set for some people as far as inviting people into this corn maze of like, what is happening? And so I just speak to that. And I found it helpful. This is a lot of information, so I can pass this along or email people. I was working closely when in the first year of this with a psychiatrist from the Mayo Clinic, because I was working with a lot of delusional individuals with fixed false beliefs about a lot of different things. And I was doing some research, and the research was depressing. So I said, what is the solution to this? And so through our back and forth, I put together the second paragraph, and from some of the, not mine, but some of the other best minds in the field of psychology, this is what ultimately it led to, which is approach them in a formal and non-threatening way, offer resources insofar as they're willing to accept them, keep things simple, review things, clarify boundaries of acceptable behavior. Like, don't ignore or say, well, it's okay for this person to behave this way, but not everyone else. I mean, it's having to adjust and adapt to what's happening in the moment and to be clear about it, and then disengage. I've seen some people kind of just stay in. It's like, my will is stronger than yours, and I'm gonna help you until you accept my help. And I get that. It's extraordinarily well-intentioned, but if someone's essentially saying, refuting, or doesn't want the help, like I'll respect that now. And if anything, sometimes that encounter of like, I hear you, I actually hear what you're saying, can maybe open up a window at a later date that oh wow, this person actually hears me even when I say I don't want your help. It's like, okay. I included types of delusions if anyone's interested. In my experience, persecutory is probably the top of the list. I've actually had some experiences with some others which are interesting, but I can talk elsewhere to anyone who's interested in about that. And then to diagnostic stuff that not too important for this. Suicidal. So we're getting close to the end, and so I want to spend a little time just talking about suicide. And I have been working either weekly or regularly with suicidal individuals for years now. And from my experience and from all the research, I want to reassure everyone, regardless of their training, experience, anything like that, that so far there is no evidence to prove that talking about suicide will lead to suicide. And this happens especially when I get calls from family members who has a younger child or whatever who is either directly or indirectly indicating that they're suicidal. And I'll ask, it's like, have you brought this up? And many of the times they say, I'm afraid to. And so this is likely to come up when working with individuals. And I'm sure people have had multiple experiences with this, and perhaps in their own lives. But I want to be really clear that the thing I would regret the most is not bringing it up, because it's like, well, what if it makes them uncomfortable? Really, what I'm saying is like, that makes me uncomfortable. So when I've brought this up to people in all different contexts, the worst reaction I got was someone like kind of give me a confused look, me like, why would I be suicidal? It's like, I don't know. And I'll ask the question and be like, no. And I'm like, okay, like that's just, it's a question I think is important to ask, and we'll move on from that. But otherwise, and there's no guarantee that someone's going to be honest and be like, yes, I am. Some people say they're not and actually are, and I'm not going to press it. But I can sometimes, again, bring up things like, well, here's why I would ask this question is based on this, this, and this. And if there's some rapport, especially if there's some rapport between two people, they won't hopefully see that as a threat or as some like some stigma related accusation. But to me, it's a pertinent question, and one that, again, going back to personal style and things, if someone's like, hey, I'm uncomfortable asking that, like, it's a great discussion to have, I think, with colleagues, or I'm more than happy to talk to anyone about that, especially if they're uncomfortable asking it, and also not being vague. And what I mean by that is, I would not recommend saying like, hey, do you sometimes think about maybe kind of not wanting to exist on this plane of, and like coming and getting into some very philosophical thing about existence or consciousness, versus, are you thinking about suicide? Are you thinking about killing yourself? And yeah, that's pretty much it. So I've belabored that, I think. Other strategies I think that have been helpful are being authentic, confident, and respectful, pretty simply. Also, talking too softly and gently. I think in most of us, especially who if you're showing up to this, you're most likely part of our group of, we for most of us, what is important is helping others, right? And a part of the helping professionals like problem is the writing instinct, right? It's like, things are awry. I want to write this thing so they can be functional and have a great life. And even if it's like they could forget about me, that's fine. That's not what's most important. What's important is that they're no longer suffering. What can happen though is, even unknowingly or unwittingly, is people can talk in very soft tones and try to coddle. And that may be appropriate at times, but there is no, I would say, not falling prey to treating them like they're about to break or something. Is just, this goes back to attitude and tone, and to even say, and this is where I'm cautious about using the word confident, not pretending to be like, oh yes, I'm an expert on suicide, let's have a discussion. Rather, it's more about recognizing, it's like, wow, that concerns me as well, like genuinely concerns me. Can you tell me more about this? And if they bring up stuff like, yeah, I don't know how to handle that right now, but just keep talking. Like, I want to understand more about this. Really quickly, working in crisis some time ago, I would have professionals that either call me or find me and say, oh my God, my client is suicidal. And I would ask for some information. I'd be like, what's going on? Like, what are they talking about? They're like, I don't know. They just said that they're suicidal. I was like, okay, I don't know if that's going to build a lot of confidence if they bring that up and all of a sudden it's mayhem and people are running around, versus, again, that attitude of, because again, in most cases, they're not actively like in a process of like, I just took a bunch of medications at that point. I don't think anyone's going to question like, what do we do? It's like, call 911 and get an aid car here and let's get them checked out. Most of the time, it's just they're thinking around it. And so getting information, asking questions, being authentic can not only help de-escalate like that pretty intense state, but can also inform like how we need to come up with a plan around this, not only to ensure safety, but to help sort of resolve this challenge. And I won't really get into how, because it's a whole can of worms regarding like personality disorders, and that can be contentious and controversial, but there are some people who have developed some, let's say, unproductive skills around using the threat of suicide to kind of get their needs met. All right. And that kind of gets into a whole nother area, but I still address it the same, because even people with established personality disorders still complete suicide. And that's a small thing too. I picked up, I was just in continuing education, is I use that word as far as completing suicide instead of committing it, which suggests some sort of guilt around it or things like that. So I think language is important, but again, this is me getting too far into the weeds. But whether someone thinks it's like, oh, they're just using this to manipulate, or they're genuinely suicidal, I'd say the approach is the same: is listening, gathering information. And for those individuals too, and I've worked with a lot of people with the established diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, is even by doing that, they tend to kind of get away from that focus and attend or bring up kind of other problems that I think are more at the core versus then bringing up the suicidal piece, and then everyone's running around and no one's really taking the time or having the presence to understand what's going on a deeper level. Any questions? So I try to keep it relatively short. I will stop sharing my screen. Uh-oh. Brian, I don't know if you can take it back.
I think so. Let me, there we go.
There we go.
Judd, thank you so much. That was super informative, and I'm imagining it brought up a lot for folks on the training today. I think what I might start with is a little reassurance for those of us who are either members or volunteers at Recovery Cafe. Yep, escalated folks who are at the cafe, difficult situations, conflicts, crises, these things will come up at some point at the cafe. It's not like if, it's more like when. So I want to manage our expectations in that way, but also to reassure you that it is not anybody's job besides staff to manage a crisis. So you as members and volunteers can play a role, certainly. And I think a lot of the information that Judd presented will be helpful for us so that we can hopefully prevent something from becoming further escalated, so we are not contributing to the crisis, right? I think that's a big role that members and volunteers can play. And also just knowing that you are not alone in this and you have no expectation to be handling a crisis. That is the job of staff. That said, I would really love to open it up to questions and answers of either the program or Judd. So I see John, your hand up. Why don't you go first? Oh, you got to unmute.
There it is. Everything froze for a moment. Judd, I appreciate your presentation. One thing I want to talk about is the suicide issue. Recognition of that can be very difficult. I unfortunately had a grandson who committed suicide. So it's very close to the family here. He was 19 years old. And we knew he was having difficulties, but did not see the depth of it. And he basically spoofed everybody in the family by all of a sudden feeling a lot better and interacting much more completely with the family. But it was a spoof, basically. He had made his decision. He was going to commit suicide, and he worked towards that goal. And in the meantime, he was just being nice to everybody, smiling and happy, but he was only happy because he'd made the decision. That really threw us all off, that he was still having his deep problems, and we lost him because of that. So suicidal issues are one that you really have to have good training in for recognition and things that go on with that. So I just wanted to emphasize that one point.
Thank you for that, John. I'm devastated to hear that story, and we will have additional training. The National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI, Jefferson County, will facilitate a training in June 18th on suicide prevention and intervention. So we'll be able to dive a lot further into that then. I saw a chat from Thais. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name.
No, you did it right.
Okay, great. And you had said, could we talk a little bit more about paraphrasing? So Judd, I was wondering if you'd be able to touch on that.
Yeah, because for me, like you said, it's really hard to go from have a personality and also paraphrase at the same time and not sound like a robot, like you said. So if you could give any hints of any sort, and I feel like sometimes when you're paraphrasing, you get people more annoyed sometimes. Like, yeah, of course, you know, that kind of thing.
So I understand you correctly. You're concerned that you may be annoying people when you attempt to paraphrase.
Yeah, not just annoying, but like sounding like a robot, right?
Yeah, I was trying to paraphrase a little bit. I know when I'm consciously like,
joke.
I know it was. I'm sorry, but this is where I'm not trying to tease you at all. It's like what, and this is the problem when talking about some of these things. Like, okay, I must paraphrase. For me personally, maybe other people, everyone thinks differently. is if I'm like, okay, I'm going to paraphrase what they're saying, I'm going to get caught up in so much. I'm not really going to listen to them. What I would say naturally to you is, if I understood what you're saying regarding worried about how they may respond to something, right? And I think this kind of gets into other issues regarding where someone else is about being really agitated or upset, emotional, whatever the case may be, around something that not only has already happened, which requires attention, but especially in cases where they're worried about what might happen. And this is where, by taking that time to talk with others about this or to self-reflect, is to be aware of that within oneself. And I think for me, paraphrasing is using, again, my own language, but I'm not embarrassed about being confused or not understanding. And there was a time where it was all, ego driven stuff, like I'm the professional, I must know what everyone is saying. And so by attending to that, I am, for people who have spoken with me, I have no problem being like, I don't understand that. I'm, and not be like, I should know what you're talking about, but I'm not really clear on that. And so paraphrasing can simply be like, I hear you kind of talking about this, but there's so much going on. So can you talk about this a little more? And so you're reflecting back something that they brought up, a point, without having to furiously take notes. And that's a mixed bag. I found some people, that helps me organize my thoughts and what people are saying, but they may think I'm not really paying attention. So it's a case by case basis where it's like, should I take notes if someone's talking? Ask them. It's like, hey, would you mind if I just write ideas down? If that's something that comes up, it may not be, or it may be something that volunteers or other people working there are asked not to do, and that's fine. I don't want to upset Brian right now or kind of talk about how people should do things, but some people said, no, I just would rather we just talk. I don't want you to write things down. That makes me nervous. I'm like, great. So I probably overly complicated that a bit. I'm
No,
sorry.
thank you.
So does
Yeah,
that,
I think it's all, yeah, no, thank you. You
yeah.
totally answered. And I think it's the active listening, right, is the most important at this point. It's just really listening to you, whatever you may be saying.
Mhm. Yes. And I know I'm struggling with that when I'm feeling this, there's no gap between someone talking and then me responding. I think small things like that. And that happens naturally, especially maybe in meetings or people we're familiar with, because we know each other pretty well, or family members. We can just but that suggests that there's less active, it's not all or nothing, but less active listening, because I'm already formulating, here's what I'm going to say. And I already got this. And that sort of shuts down some subtle things they may be saying, or even not really what they're saying, but how they're saying it, and body language and other factors. And so my intention not to overwhelm anyone. I can't maintain that much attention. And some people may, let's say, struggle with ADHD or ADHD related symptoms, but there's methods that they personally are able to develop, especially once the non-judgmental. Because if I took a class right now and they asked me to explain all the different ways to paraphrase, I'd be like, I couldn't tell you. I'd have to review and spout that out, but go back to what I have found works for me and my personal style. And so I want to really reiterate that and it's okay to admire someone too. I've seen people have really excellent skills in some areas, and I'll work with them about that. Like, hey, you're really good at this, and have a conversation, but not assume that I need to do exactly things the way they do it to be, good at something. So yeah.
Thank you. That was really well said. Something I wanted to offer, and Judd talked some about this, for the purposes of being here at Recovery Cafe, and when there's a crisis going on. What we're trying to build here is a community where there are certain cultural expectations for being in the space. There are these guiding principles that we're all agreeing to by being a part of it. There are things that we talk about when we open the cafe and we do our morning announcements. We say, here are the guiding principles to connect with divine love in ourselves and others, to cultivate compassion, show respect, encourage growth, practice forgiveness, and give back. and we say those at our recovery circles as well. What we hope is that these messages become so internalized, so ingrained in the ethos of the cafe, that we let those guidelines do the work for us. Those are the expectations for being present here, so that when we have someone who is having a hard time that day, for whatever reason, becoming escalated in crisis, whatever it is, right? Then it isn't a personal thing. It's not because I don't like you. It's not because you're a bad person or something. It's about this behavior and these expectations for being in this space. So we more or less are kind of appealing to this higher authority. And then it's also not about me either. It's not because I don't like you or I'm being a jerk or something like that, right? So that's what I hope is setting these really clear boundaries and expectations at the outset will help all of us, like a lot of, the volunteers and members in particular, for knowing what are the parameters for being present in this space today. And I hope that actually does a lot at the beginning, front loading, we would call it, for making sure that these crises don't become crises, actually. Sean, I see your hand up.
Sorry, I was about to.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Haynes, for all your expertise and everything. Because of social media, because of the George Floyd incident, of course, we have cell phone cameras so we can record all this. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but did they kill him? He was killed because of a counterfeit $20 bill. He tried to pass a counterfeit $20 bill. I think he had previous, sorry about that. I think he had previous problems, run-ins with the law. But we all know that there's no way he should have kept his knee on his neck for 9 minutes. And I'm not trying, anyway, and I know there's a lot of good cops. I think I probably 95% of police are going to the job to really protect and serve and really help us. And there's that little probably less than 5% that are racist, like the young black gentleman that got shot 7 times in the back, unarmed, right, walking away from the cops.
Hey, Sean, if you don't mind, if I could just interject real quick. This is a hot topic, and I know Judd works for the police department here in Port Townsend, or is, embedded in the police department here, and is responding to these kinds of calls that may have helped in a situation like with George Floyd. It is a super important topic, and I would love to have that discussion on maybe the training.
Brian, it's all part of my question, okay?
Okay.
It's part of my question. I'm not going off on a tangent. I'm just saying, when it deals to mental health, like the mental health calls, and that's what we're talking about, right? I mean, mental health stuff. And like on a call, you guys have like a mental health unit that can go with you on the call, like someone that works for the mental health department that goes with you on a call to someone that's possibly has a mental health problem or something like that. They'll ride along someone that can help de-escalate that situation.
Yeah, excellent question. Because it's a big one, and I will try to stay focused with it. So yes, and that's my role primarily, is to ride around with I have my own vehicle too, so in case they're responding to a call that's unrelated, and that gets blurry too, right? Because yesterday I went on a call because someone died of natural causes, but I showed up too to be supportive of family and saying it can be overwhelming, not only just that loss, the grief and loss stuff immediately when it happens, but here are resources should you need them. But also people in mental health crises is be present, and if not physically there, and this is where each program is going to be different depending on where it is, just like the Recovery Cafe is going to be different compared to similar institutions. Is in rural areas, and Jefferson County I would consider a rural area, there are not as many of these embedded direct working with law enforcement. What I can tell you is that this agency at least has mandatory, and they've done it on their own and do a little more than what they're mandated to do as far as crisis intervention training, to work with, and there's specific trainings with people who have severe mental health issues or having an emotional crisis where like weapons are involved, to try to resolve it in every possible scenario as far as the force continuum from the Department of Justice is concerned. I think that's sort of the if this then that, if this then that. And so yes, and they also call me on the phone. I mean, this is a small department. I can't speak for other departments. It's a small department, so I've worked directly with pretty much every officer here, which is nice. and get a sense of sort of their comfort level with how to respond. And to me, this applies not only whether it be law enforcement or volunteers or anyone from any agency, is that there is room to adapt and develop different skills around how to attend to this. And there's so much nuance to every situation that, I mean, even when I get calls, they're just saying like, yeah, we're not sure what to do because here's all these variables that are unknown to us. And if we go into this room, we're afraid if this happens, it may get ugly. And so it's like, sometimes there isn't a great option in the mix. But it's being able to have that conversation and slow things down. And this is where I think in crisis, the expectation is like, oh my gosh, we got to resolve this right away. Not just from the person, but from the people sitting there with them. And I have to remember, it's like, they didn't just arrive at crisis. I mean, it may have been weeks, months, or years getting to this point. So for me to say it's like I have some magical solution that's just going to attend to this crisis and it'll never come back, it's crazy arrogant. So it's the same for law enforcement. And you know, if anything, I hope that there has been some flexibility with inviting people like me into different institutions, and that there is a little more cross communication going on, and it's not just everyone in their little spheres saying, you know, here's what we do and we don't do X, Y, or Z. That so much of it goes back and forth. And I don't know. Again, it's hard for me to respond to that question without getting into so much other stuff. But if you were to ask me specifically, how does Port Townsend Police Department address crises? It's like I try to reinforce that nearly every day. It's like each response is going to be different, period. And to slow down. And a lot of times suicidal calls, especially, I'll be like, let me try to call them first versus showing up with lights and sirens and like, you know, we're here to help, we swear, right? And running at people is, let me try to call them and have a conversation first. It's like, hey, we got to call. This person's really concerned what's going on. And sometimes we're able to resolve that and come up with a plan, and they don't have to deal with the stress of fire department and law enforcement showing up in their front yard. So sorry, I know, Sean.
Thanks, Judd. I appreciate your response. Thank you. I appreciate it. I'm glad you guys have a, you know, a whole plan for that, because I think a lot of law enforcement agencies do not, and it gets escalated. And I've seen, you know, several times we see on the news when someone's mental health, they end up getting killed, and so by the cops. So I'm glad we have that here.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think really quickly, I just want to say that this also brings up a thing where I think unfortunately I've heard, and even people in law enforcement say that's not my job, and I'm like, well, you can say that, but it's definitely a part of it, an aspect of it. And I think this is true again for professionals, volunteers, and anything. Is like, it's not my job to, let's say, well, it is kind of my job to help them find housing, but like resolve like this recent issue this morning of complicated civil legal issue. I'm not an attorney, so I can't resolve that for them, but I can listen to them, allow them vent a little bit, and be clear. It's like, look, this is not, I don't have expertise in landlord tenant issues. I really don't. I can investigate a little bit and take the time and energy and respect to not just say, I don't know anything about it, talk to some other person. And say, yeah, okay, I looked into it a little bit. I've talked to some people, try to remove some red tape, but being clear, here's what I can do with this as far as being helpful. And law enforcement being able to say, it's like, I don't know how to resolve your family of origin issues. I wish I did, but I know people who can, right? Or something like to that effect. So, and Brian, you should just mute me whenever you want.
No, that's great. That is super informative and interesting. I think, and I'm grateful for your question, Sean. And I think your role is an example of a trend, a shift in how we think about public safety and law enforcement. I provided in the chat an example of another program in Oregon called Cahoots, which is basically a whole team of judges within a law enforcement agency. And there's examples of these across the country as well. Some of them have been around for a couple decades, actually. I think the trend as far as how it's catching on is probably a little more recent, but anyway, I think it's an exciting development and something that I'm very curious to see play out. I'm quite hopeful that having someone like Judd on law enforcement will help to reduce things like you brought up, Sean, whether it's police violence or it's someone in a mental health crisis ending up in the legal system, things like this. So I'm wondering if there's any other questions from folks on the topics that Judd presented. I see Jill, and then Ray, I will do you afterward.
Judd, I didn't get your second credential, mental health counselor and.
SUDP. So
What is that?
substance use. Oh my gosh, hold on. It used to be CDP. Substance use. Brian, help me.
Substance disorder
Substance-
professional.
Substance use disorder professional. Oh my gosh, I know.
They
Like,
recently changed it from chemical dependency professional.
yeah. So it was.
Say it again.
I'll put it in the chat. It's substance use disorder professional.
Uh,
Thank you.
Yeah.
There's letters.
And Rhea, I saw your hand up.
Yes, as not as a professional, as a person in the community, sitting with somebody who may be escalating. And I don't know what the rule is for the Recovery Cafe, and you might be able to help with this, Brian. I have a tendency to touch someone. I have a tendency to put my hand on their hand and connect with my eyes if that seems appropriate, or put my hand on their shoulder or something. I'm that kind of a person to do that. And so I'm wondering if you would speak to that.
As for policy here in the cafe, I'm very curious to hear what Judd has to say in his experience working in the field. As for policy here at that cafe, it somewhat becomes a moot point because of COVID right now. We are supposed to maintain 6 feet of distance. Yes, so outside of COVID, in a post-pandemic world, if we can imagine such a thing, it is very much an it depends situation here at the cafe. It depends on your relationship with this person. Do you already know them? Have you interacted with them frequently? Have you, do you have that kind of relationship where safe, healthy touch is okay? I would say, shoulder, elbow, arm. Often people feel comforted by such a thing, but people act differently when they're in crisis. And something that might have been comforting to them before may not be comforting to them in a crisis. I think a question that's helpful to ask ourselves is this a need of mine that I'm meeting? Because maybe I'm uncomfortable with the situation unfolding in front of me, and I feel like reaching out would even calm me down a little bit. I don't know, right? So I don't have a good answer for you because I don't know if there is one as far as here at the cafe. I, in general, would be very cautious about touching somebody in a crisis. I would definitely want to ask, like Dave just put in there, permission, because we were crossing a boundary, physical space boundary for somebody. I would love to hear what Judd has to say from his experience.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Well, and you started that question with saying, like, not as a professional, right? Like a therapist, and even then, that can be an interesting thing because some therapists will do that, and hopefully they do it in a way that's not kind of taking advantage of their sort of power over someone, and not like in touching it in an appropriate way, but just touching at all, because there's so much of someone's history where that may indeed be very helpful to them. Alternatively, it may be something that they will accept but not really appreciate. And so it's such on the continuum. But personally, I mean, I grew up in a family where we couldn't, like, with 2 other brothers, and we couldn't disengage from anything without my mother forcing us to hug. So that forced me into like a hugger kind of person. And even, with COVID, I'm like, I have this like this weird physical reaction where I kind of jerk forward, and I'm like, oh, we can't do that, right? So it's so embedded in me, like as a hugger, right? Just men, women, we'll hug it out. It's all good. I don't do that with clients, obviously. So I had to learn, like, nope. but personally, yeah. And so I think the some of the replies, yes, is asking, but or hopefully having some time to develop a relationship with someone a little bit and even discuss it. And I think having Brian or other people around or other volunteers, like, and hopefully for someone not to feel like, oh, this is a stupid question or it's a waste of someone's time, but being like, yeah, we were talking and it just kind of happened naturally. And having that discussion to where it's like, what's my stuff, what's theirs? It's both of ours. So which is it helpful or not? Things like that, and not getting analysis paralysis around this, but just identifying. It's like, yeah, these subtle things we do, and whether or not it was helpful is, I think, a relevant conversation. But yeah, just initiating that. For someone I just met, I don't know, because I would have to, I'm assuming a lot about them that they're comfortable with that. And that's a lot of cultural factors too. Like up here, when I moved up here, I didn't see a lot of initial, like, hey, nice to meet you, and coming in for a hug. Like they'd be like, what are you doing? So, so there's that. And, but I appreciate that question. And I think it can go both ways. I don't think it's necessarily going to like create crazy harm, because real quick, I promise, there was one of the favorite studies I ever came across was about people who experience, like, I mean, terrible trauma. I mean, terrible trauma. I won't get into details around that. I'm sure Heather and Brian are aware of this one. But people, I mean, they couldn't talk. They were so impaired. But they started, these volunteers would come in, or other people, and doing pedicure, manicures. Right. So it's like they had a task. They were doing these manicures, and just by that natural kind of touch where there's purpose around it, like, hey, we're just going to clean up your nails and polish them and stuff like that. It actually created a bridge. And a lot of these individuals started shifting a little bit from that place of just almost being catatonic and opening up. And it was accidental in a way, but then they kind of created more focus around it. So touch can be very powerful, is my point. But again, there's so many other factors, and I think these are great conversations to have in that space with Brian and other staff and other volunteers. I'm muting myself now.
Yeah, no, thank you, Jed. And I will reiterate that point. We as staff are always happy, and in fact, very much encourage these kinds of discussions, before an interaction. If you know you're going to be encountering somebody, after an interaction, we can debrief it, check things out, get perspective, maybe learn a few things. It's all one of the things I love about this place is, what the intention that we're trying to create here is, the rest of the world has this inherent hierarchy, this inherent power dynamic, and we're not going to dismantle that completely in the larger culture. But here at the cafe, we are trying to create it so that everybody comes into the space knowing that I'm not here to fix you. I've got stuff I'm working on as well, right? So I've got stuff to learn from you. And this is not me depositing knowledge, me giving you something you don't have because I assume that you're on some kind of lower level or something like that, right? There are so many problematic assumptions that I think a lot of us make, myself included, because that's what I've been socialized to believe in the greater culture. So I only bring that up to say that I very much encourage those kinds of discussions, because we have a lot to learn about ourselves, as well as how do we support someone else's recovery. I want to keep an eye on the time here. So we have about just over 10 minutes left in the training. This has been incredibly helpful. So I want to say thank you to Judd. We do have a little bit more time for more questions if something else has come up for somebody before we leave today.
Just real quick, Judd, does the Port Townsend Police Department, when they first hire people on, do they have any kind of training to deal for the police themselves, if they don't have the ride along, whatever, to deal with the suicide crisis or mental health patient crisis, kind of intervention training?
Do they have training before they're hired here?
Yeah.
So with respect to them, any kind of questions like that, I'll answer that, but in a way, it's like I direct, like, well, that would be a question you'd have to directly ask law enforcement, because I don't pretend to be law enforcement or represent, like, or I don't know, what is it, like their PIO, whatever that position is, where they're police information officer. What I can say is that is an element, not across the board, but especially in this area, that there is training. And if they have some training, they will get more. I've actually done some trainings with law enforcement, and they have to do other trainings as well. So yes, here in his department, they don't treat it as like a chore. It's just, it's a part of all their other more law enforcement related things, like knowing actual laws and things like that, which seem to change constantly as crisis intervention. So CIT is definitely a part of the mix as far as what they're expected to know.
Thanks, Jed. Thank you.
And Jill, I saw your hand up. You're on mute. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Or I thought I did. Would you mind putting your email address up again? I got most of it.
Jay Haynes, oh, did it come up? Okay.
Yeah, but
I'm also happy to follow up when I have the link to the video. I will share that as well as Judd's contact.
You go.
I see Carol, your hand up.
Hi, everybody. I just want to thank you, Judd, for helping my unhoused friends. I've heard your name, and I think that you've really, so thank you for that. And it was also wonderful having you guide the human services group under the ICG. So I don't know, I'm feeling very, very positive that things are coming together. And please excuse me for dropping out. I was, there's a little crisis in my family I was trying to organize, and I think it's successfully resolving itself. It was essentially a multi-generational family with an extremely vulnerable sister of my husband, where we have the vax pushback, and she wants to get the vax shot. And I think we're trying to manage that. So I dropped out. I'm looking forward to doing the entire program later. Thank you.
And anyone's free to contact me. I mean, if I'm unavailable, I'll call you back as soon as I can. But be sure you know what you're getting into, because we can talk about some very unpleasant things or challenging things or with no available solution. But just the discourse around it, I've found to be really enjoyable, and just to appreciate that, I suppose. So please don't hesitate if you have anything you're curious about to contact me directly.
Go ahead, John, just a couple minutes left. Yep.
All right, I'm Judd. I'm on the Citizens Advisory Committee for the Sheriff's Department in Jefferson County. And we've been talking about this kind of personnel to have to go out on certain crises with the sheriff or with a deputy, and or have, someone such as yourself go out ahead of it to see if they can resolve it without having a patrol car sent every time. And it, not at this point, but maybe I'll contact you. I'd like to have a little more discussion with you about something of that nature. You have in the Port Townsend Police Department, a smaller geographical area to cover, which probably helps with one person, but the whole county, or all of Eastern Jefferson County, is a lot for Sheriff's Department. And then you've got the West End as well, so where you can have these things. But I would like to follow up with a one-on-one with you regarding that and its development in Port Townsend, if at all possible.
Yes, of course, I'm available for that. Before we run out of time, I wanted to extend this to Brian. I didn't get into it because it would probably have taken over everything, but the discussion around, and again, this term gets overused, boundaries, right? And so this is where talking about expectations, and Brian talked about this a little bit, but hopefully having discussions around that, especially around crisis, because there are ways to include those into those situations as far as realistic options, because I think it was Carol mentioning me contacting a lot of people, homeless individuals. A few aren't super fans of mine because kind of what they're asking me to do hasn't necessarily been helpful to them. And so kind of putting boundaries around, hey, this is what I can actually offer right now, and it's not what they want. And that impasse can create some conflict. It doesn't really necessarily go to crisis, but with that being said, it's like how to introduce, maintain, and those boundaries. And I imagine if Brandon already hasn't organized that, it will be an ongoing discussion. But that is a big element too of not only once someone's de-escalated is how to introduce those. Because I think who was it? Nicole mentioned from Haynes Plate, Jefferson Transit is behavior, right? It's that there may be systematic problems and stuff that have led to this, or family stuff, that abuse or who knows, all these things. So I'm not blaming the victim here, but there's also behaviors that are inappropriate. And so how to not only pay attention and be present, but also say, it's like, hey, this behavior isn't okay. And here's kind of what we need to see, or whatever the case may be. And so law enforcement ends up doing that a lot when I'm with them, but for people to not feel like they just have to endure someone's behavior, especially in a place like Recovery Cafe, where there's a lot of other individuals, hopefully their staff, volunteers, to where it's not just, we're here for one person. It's like, we're here for them, and hopefully not casting people out who behave poorly one time or two times. But so anyway, I just wanted to say that briefly.
Yeah, thank you, Jed. And you're totally right. Boundaries is an ongoing training and topic of discussion. I think it is incredibly helpful, because it helps us determine also what is my crisis and what is that other person's crisis. We can so easily take that on because it's scary. We have our physiological response, like Jed was talking about, where this person is needing this thing right now, and I know I can give them this thing right now. Well, there are boundaries at the Recovery Cafe for being a volunteer. And as we go forward and do our orientations, and you guys are coming into the building, we'll have these discussions, right? But one clear example, right, is we don't give out cash to anybody. I don't give somebody money, not me, not volunteers, not members, nobody is exchanging cash in the cafe. That's just one example of something that's a hard and fast boundary that you don't have to establish for yourself, because it's established already, because those things help keep us safe. Now, in the context of a crisis, there are going to be other boundaries, right? But a topic for another day. So I think with that, what I want to do is say thank you again to Jed for your time. That was incredibly helpful. I'm glad for all of you to attend today. It was lovely to have you. We will have our ongoing monthly volunteer trainings the third Friday of the month. Next month is April 16th, which is Mental Health Basics, taught by NAMI Jefferson County. That one will also be recorded. We're going to continue operating on Zoom until further notice. Again, the cafe is open on Thursdays from 1 to 3 p.m. If you'd like to stop by, we'd love to see you there. Sean, real quick.
Are we going into third phase statewide Monday? Yes or no?
March 22nd is phase 3, indeed.
Yes. Progress.
That's right, progress. On that happy note, I will bless and release you. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thank you.